One pilot died in a training accident 8 days before this war even started. And what that single crash quietly exposed about Iran's entire air force turned out to matter more than almost anyone realized at the time. Because it wasn't really a story about one bad night in western Iran. It was the first visible crack in a much bigger structural problem that the rest of this war would spend the following months exposing piece by piece. Think about that timing for a second, because it's the whole reason this story matters at all. Militaries run training exercises constantly, all over the world, and most of the time, a single accident report barely makes it past the local news cycle. This one should have been exactly that. A few lines in state media, a brief mention of an investigation, and then silence. Instead, it landed in the middle of the most dangerous standoff Iran had faced with Washington in years, and it happened at a base that, within weeks, would become one of the very first targets hit once real shooting started. That combination, routine accident, extraordinary timing, is exactly why this crash deserves a much closer look than it got in the moment. Here's exactly what happened, and I want to walk through the timeline carefully because the date matters just as much as the crash itself. On the night of February 19th into February 20th, 2026, an Iranian Air Force jet went down during a nighttime training exercise in the No-Baran district of Hamadan province in western Iran, a rural stretch of territory known far more for its agriculture than for its role in national defense. Iranian state broadcaster IRIB confirmed one of the two pilots aboard was killed while the other survived. TRT World, citing Reuters, reported the aircraft crashed during that late-night exercise, and Iranian officials said the cause of the accident was still under investigation. The Jerusalem Post, citing Iran's semi-official Mehr news agency, quoted Hamzeh Emrai, the deputy governor of Hamadan province for political security and social affairs, describing how rescue personnel were dispatched to the crash site almost immediately. Al Arabiya English, citing the semi-official Fars news agency, confirmed the same basic details. An Iranian Air Force aircraft going down during a night training mission. One pilot dead, one alive, cause unknown. That's the official record. Straight from Iranian state and semi-official outlets themselves, not speculation from outside the country. Now here's the detail that turns a routine, tragic training accident into something worth actually paying attention to. This crash didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened while President Trump was actively issuing Tehran an ultimatum and massively ramping up American military presence across the Middle East, deploying warships, fighter jets, and additional hardware into the region as he pushed to block Iran from advancing any nuclear weapons capability. That's not me connecting dots after the fact. That context was already sitting directly next to the crash, reporting at the time. And just 8 days after that jet went down in Hamadan, on February 28th, the war actually started, with coordinated American and Israeli strikes hitting Iranian targets and killing Iran's supreme leader in the opening hours. So, this wasn't some crash that happened years before the conflict, disconnected from everything that followed. This was a fatal accident inside Iran's own Air Force during a routine training flight, happening in the exact final stretch before that Air Force was about to be tested in the most serious way it had faced in decades. So let's actually get into what this reveals, layer by layer, because the where of this crash turns out to be almost as important as the what. The crash happened in Hamadan province, and Hamadan is not a random patch of Iranian territory. It's home to the 3rd Tactical Fighter Base, also known by its older names Cherokee and Nojeh, and according to detailed reporting from the aviation outlet Key. Arrow, that base houses the 31st Tactical Fighter Squadron of the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, a unit that Key. Arrow specifically describes as operating the largest single concentration of F-4E Phantom jets anywhere in Iran's entire frontline Air Force structure. We're talking about 17 F-4Es stationed at that one base alone out of a total Iranian inventory that Key. Arrow puts at 41 F-4Es across the whole country at the point the broader air war against Iran intensified. So when a training jet goes down at Hamadan specifically, you're not just looking at an isolated unlucky accident. You're looking at a crash inside the single most concentrated cluster of Iran's most numerous frontline strike aircraft, a base that military planners on the other side of this conflict would have already circled as one of the highest value air targets in the entire country. And that's exactly what happened to it. Key. Arrow's reporting on the broader air campaign describes the F-4Es at Hamadan as being among the earliest and most strategically significant targets once the wider coalition air operation got underway, specifically because of their long-range strike capability and their geographic position relative to key ingress routes from the west. The very base where a training jet had gone down just over a week before full-scale war broke out turned out to be one of the first places hit once it did. Let's talk about why that single base carries so much weight, because it forces you to ask an uncomfortable question about the aircraft themselves. Why is a modern Air Force in the year 2026 still training pilots and still losing pilots on an aircraft platform that first entered American service back in the early 1960s? The F-4 Phantom II is not a modern jet by any reasonable definition. National Security Journal's reporting lays out the basic history plainly. Iran acquired more than 200 F-4s from the United States before the 1979 Islamic Revolution, back when Washington and Tehran were still close allies. Once the revolution happened and the relationship flipped entirely, sanctions cut Iran off from the very supply chain that kept those aircraft flying. National Security Journal reports that ever since, maintaining that Phantom fleet has been a persistent structural problem for Iran, one the country has never fully solved. The national interest's own reporting on the type is even more specific about the mechanism behind that problem. American sanctions implemented after the revolution made it extremely difficult for Iran's Air Force to procure legitimate spare parts for aircraft that were, after all, built by an American company for an American ally. So Iran had to improvise. The national interest reports Iran turned to reverse engineering, manufacturing its own substitute components domestically, and it notes plainly that those indigenously produced parts often lack the quality and durability of the originals, functioning as short-term fixes that demand constant, ongoing attention just to keep the aircraft airworthy at all. Think about what that actually means in practical terms for the pilots flying those jets. You're strapping into an aircraft, older than most of the pilots flying it, held together in part by domestically reverse-engineered components that everyone involved already knows are less reliable than the originals they replaced. And you're doing it for routine nighttime training exercises, not even combat missions. Key. Aero's separate reporting on how Iran keeps its Phantom fleet flying adds another layer to this picture. As of the reporting available, 58 F-4D and F-4E Phantoms remained in Iranian service across 5 squadrons at 4 separate air bases, and only about 60% of that total fleet was actually airworthy at any given time. Read that statistic again. 60% airworthy. That means, on paper, nearly 4 out of every 10 Phantoms in Iran's entire inventory were sitting, grounded, non-mission capable at any given moment, and that's before you even get to whatever specific mechanical issue actually brought down the jet at Hamadan that night. Key. Aero's reporting also points to something worth sitting with, and that's the role of Iran's Mehrabad aircraft overhaul complex in Tehran, which the outlet describes as playing a key role in keeping the Phantom fleet operational, specifically by repairing airframes that have already suffered structural and severe damage in prior accidents and incidents. Prior accidents and incidents, plural. That phrase alone tells you this Hamadan crash wasn't an isolated statistical fluke. It was one entry in an ongoing pattern serious enough that Iran has an entire dedicated overhaul complex whose job partly includes rebuilding airframes that already got damaged the same way once before. This pattern goes back years, well before this specific war ever started. Reporting from RFE RL's Radio Farda, covering a separate Iranian F-14 Tomcat crash back in 2022, documented that the pilot and co-pilot ejected safely during a landing at Shahid Babaye base in Isfahan, after what officials called a technical failure. And the same report noted that Iran's Air Force still operates an assortment of U.S.-made aircraft purchased before the 1979 revolution, alongside Russian-made MiG and Sukhoi types, with decades of Western sanctions, making it hard to obtain spare parts and properly maintain that aging fleet. That same reporting flagged that just 1 month earlier, in May of that year, a separate fighter jet had crashed in Iran's central desert, killing both pilots, and that in February of that same year, another jet had gone down directly into a soccer field in the northwestern city of Tabriz, killing both pilots on board and a civilian on the ground. Sputnik News, covering that same 2022 period, put it in blunt terms. Iran has seen a series of similar jet crashes in recent months and pointed to the exact same root cause: an Air Force fleet comprised largely of outdated aircraft that Tehran has been unable to properly upgrade because of the burden of Western sanctions. So this is not a new story. This is a recurring, well-documented pattern stretching back years, and the Hamadan crash in February of 2026 was simply the latest entry in it, arriving at the single worst possible moment, days before that same aging, accident-prone fleet was about to be tested in an actual shooting war against 2 of the most capable air forces on the planet. There's a historical layer to the F-4's role in Iran that makes this even more striking, and it comes from a source you wouldn't necessarily expect, an archive dedicated specifically to the history of the Imperial Iranian Air Force. That archive's own account of the F-4's service history describes the Phantom as having been undeniably the backbone of the Iranian Air Force during the country's 8-year war with Iraq back in the 1980s, a role the archive notes it was, even decades later, still fulfilling to the best of the Iranian Air Force's technical ability. That same source recounts a specific wartime incident where an Iranian F-4, despite suffering partial hydraulic failure, engine problems, and severe damage to its wing and fuselage, still managed to land and was subsequently rebuilt and returned to active service after 6,000 man-hours and 2.5 months of dedicated repair work. 6,000 man-hours to save one badly damaged Cold War-era airframe. That level of effort tells you everything about how precious and how irreplaceable each individual Phantom actually is to an Air Force that hasn't been able to buy a new one in almost 50 years. And that same archive specifically identifies Hamadan, under its older name Shahroki, as the historic home of the 31st and 32nd Fighter Wings, meaning the base where this training crash happened isn't just significant because of what's stationed there today. It's been the beating heart of Iran's Phantom Force since the earliest years of the Islamic Republic itself. Now stop for a second and hold both timelines in your head at once, because that's really the whole point of this breakdown. 8 days, crash, investigation opened, war begins. 10 days after that, the very base tied to that crash gets hit in a coordinated strike. Roughly 2 months after that, the exact category of aircraft everyone assumed was too old to matter turns up flying penetration missions against American bases in Kuwait. None of those individual events is shocking on its own. Strung together in order, they tell a single, continuous story about exactly how much a 40-year-old sanctions regime can shape the outcome of a war that started decades after those sanctions were first imposed, and how a headline about one crashed jet can end up connecting to almost every other headline that follows it. Now here's the part that I think is genuinely the most important piece of this entire story, because it's not just about F-4 Phantoms. Bolt Flight's detailed breakdown of Iran's overall combat aviation inventory describes the country's entire air power structure as, in its words, a hybrid force of Cold War-era aircraft, domestically modified fighters, and a small number of newer Russian and Chinese designs, with many of the aircraft still flying today having originally been delivered before the 1979 revolution. Alongside the Phantom, Bolt Flight's reporting points to roughly 40 Grumman F-14 Tomcats believed to remain in Iranian service, though it notes the number actually flight-ready at any given moment is likely far lower than that headline figure, plus the Northrop F-5 Tiger, another aircraft type dating back to the same Cold War-era procurement wave. And it's worth pausing specifically on the F-14 because its story is even more extreme than the Phantoms. The F-14 Tomcat was retired by its original operator, the United States Navy, back in 2006, replaced entirely by newer platforms and, for the most part, physically destroyed afterward, specifically so that no components could ever end up back in Iranian hands through the parts black market. Iran is, today, the only country left on the planet still flying the type in any operational capacity. And Bolt Flight's own reporting is careful to note that while roughly 40 Tomcats are believed to remain in the Iranian inventory, the number that's actually flight-ready at any given moment is likely far lower than that headline figure suggests. So you've got a nation flying the last operational examples of a fighter jet that its country of origin considered so sensitive, it destroyed the spares specifically to keep Iran from sustaining it decades after everyone else in the world moved on. That's not a footnote. That's practically its own case study in how far a country will go to keep flying something it has no legitimate way to replace. So walk through what that actually adds up to. An Air Force where a majority of its most numerous frontline aircraft are older than the pilots flying them. An Air Force forced to reverse engineer its own spare parts because the legitimate supply chain has been cut off for more than 4 decades. An Air Force where independent reporting puts real-world airworthiness at somewhere around 60% for its most common airframe. An Air Force flying the last operational Tomcats on the planet, decades after their own country of origin, tried to make sure that would be impossible. And an Air Force with a documented multi-year pattern of fatal training accidents tied directly back to that same aging equipment and that same maintenance strain. That's the actual picture sitting underneath a single, seemingly routine crash report out of Hamadan province in the final week before this war began. Here's where it gets genuinely strange, though, because this story doesn't end with Iran's Air Force simply being weak and outdated. It ends somewhere far more complicated, and honestly, far more insane than that. Reporting from the Eurasian Times, published in late April as the war was already well underway, described how many defense analysts had gone into this conflict, treating the entire U.S.-Iran air war as a straightforward mismatch, a David and Goliath scenario where Iran's outdated Air Force, built largely around 1970s-era American combat aircraft like the Phantom, simply wouldn't be a serious factor. And the F-5 Tiger specifically, according to that same reporting, was viewed as even less relevant than the Phantom. Iran was believed to be operating somewhere between 35 and 50 of these F-5 jets before the war began, according to various estimates cited in that reporting, aircraft that are themselves over 5 decades old at this point. The Eurasian Times reported plainly that, given the age of these jets, no one expected Tehran to actually employ them during the war, let alone use them for penetrating and bombing missions against American military bases in nearby Gulf countries. And that underestimation, according to that same Eurasian Times reporting, is precisely what created a dangerous sense of overconfidence and complacency among American troops stationed in the region. The jets that everyone had already written off as too old, too degraded, too unreliable to matter, the exact same category of aircraft responsible for years of fatal training crashes back home, ended up being used to strike at Gulf bases specifically because nobody on the other side seriously planned for that possibility. The headline value here isn't subtle. A 60-year-old aircraft type, flown by a country that has spent decades unable to keep this exact category of jet from crashing during ordinary training runs, still managed to expose a real gap in American defensive planning, purely because everyone assumed a fleet this old and this troubled couldn't possibly still pose a credible threat. That's the actual complete picture the Hamadan crash was quietly pointing toward, if you knew to look for it back in February. On one side, an Air Force so degraded by more than 4 decades of sanctions that it cannot reliably keep its own pilots alive during nighttime training exercises on home soil, with a documented multi-year pattern of fatal accidents to prove it. On the other side, that exact same aging, accident-prone fleet still carrying enough residual capability and benefiting from just enough adversary overconfidence to catch modern, well-resourced defenses off guard once real combat actually started. Those two facts don't contradict each other. They're the same story, told from 2 different angles. An Air Force can be simultaneously falling apart from the inside and still dangerous to underestimate from the outside. And this specific war appears to have proven both halves of that at once. There's one more thread worth pulling here, because it goes directly to the question of why Iran keeps flying aircraft this old in the first place, rather than simply replacing them. Key. Arrow's reporting on Iran's broader modernization efforts points to Tehran's repeated and repeatedly complicated attempts to acquire modern Sukhoi Su-35 fighters from Russia as a genuine replacement path, an agreement that aviation expert Babak Tagvai has described going through periods of being called off and then revived again, tied up in Moscow's own shifting political calculations rather than purely Iranian decision-making. That tells you Iran isn't flying 50 and 60-year-old jets by some kind of stubborn choice or nostalgia. It's flying them because every realistic alternative, whether that's reestablishing a legitimate American supply chain that sanctions permanently severed, or securing a reliable modern platform from Russia, has been blocked, delayed, or politically unreliable for going on half a century now. The F-4s and F-5s and F-14s still in Iran's inventory today aren't a strategic preference. They're what's left after every other door got closed one at a time, and the Hamadan crash is what happens when a country keeps flying that same increasingly fragile inventory long after any other air force on Earth would have retired it. And once the war did start, the pattern that single crash hinted at played out on a much bigger scale almost immediately. A running public tally of aviation losses during this conflict, compiled from visual evidence and official statements from all sides involved, documents Iranian aircraft being destroyed on the ground within the earliest days of the fighting. On March 1st, just a day into the war, 2 Iranian fighters, a Northrop F-5 and a McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, were destroyed in an Israeli strike at Tabriz Shahid Madani International Airport in the country's northeast. The very next day, March 2nd, U.S. Central Command released footage confirming the destruction of 2 additional Iranian aircraft, Sukhoi Su-22s belonging to the IRGC's Aerospace Force, at Shiraz's Shahid Dasgaib International Airport. That's aircraft being wiped out in pairs, on consecutive days, at bases hundreds of miles apart, in the opening 72 hours of the war alone. It's the exact outcome you'd expect for an Air Force whose most numerous frontline type was already documented before the war even started, as having roughly 40% of its fleet grounded and non-mission capable on a normal day. Aircraft that can't disperse fast enough, can't generate enough sorties, and can't be hidden or repaired quickly enough under pressure end up exactly where these did, destroyed on the tarmac rather than lost in the air. There's one more piece of this early wartime picture worth knowing, because it shows just how aware Iran's own military was of exactly this vulnerability. Reporting on the opening week of the air campaign notes that despite the losses at Tabriz and Shiraz, Iran avoided even heavier losses across its broader aviation fleet, specifically because it had preemptively relocated its operational aircraft into underground shelters and bases concentrated in the eastern part of the country, well outside the immediate reach of the earliest strikes. Think about what that decision actually tells you. Iran's own commanders clearly understood, going into this war, that their frontline aircraft sitting exposed on open tarmac at bases like Hamadan, Tabriz, and Shiraz were sitting ducks the moment real fighting started. That's not a guess on my part. That's the logical conclusion of a fleet-wide relocation decision made specifically to protect exactly the kind of aging, hard-to-replace airframes we've been talking about this entire video. The Hamadan crash happened before that relocation decision, at a base that hadn't yet been emptied out, which is part of why it ended up sitting in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong moment when the earliest strikes came looking for it. It's also worth stepping back and asking what actually happened to Iran's own official investigation into the Hamadan crash, because that question tells its own story. Iranian officials said at the time that the cause was under investigation, and the deputy governor overseeing the region promised additional information would be announced later. As of everything available in the public reporting on this incident, no detailed cause was ever formally released to the public before the war itself overtook the news cycle entirely 8 days later. That's not necessarily suspicious on its own. Militaries everywhere are often slow or selective about publicizing the findings of crash investigations, especially ones involving frontline combat squadrons, stationed at strategically sensitive bases. But it does mean the single most direct piece of evidence, the actual technical cause of why this particular jet went down on this particular night, never became part of the public record before the war made the entire question moot. Whatever internal report Iran's Air Force produced on that Naubaran district crash effectively disappeared into the same fog that swallowed a huge amount of other detail once the shooting started 8 days later. Let's also talk about the human side of this for a second, because it's easy to get lost in airframe statistics and forget there was an actual person killed in that cockpit over Naubaran district. Training a fighter pilot in any air force on the planet takes years, not months, and represents one of the single most expensive, most carefully cultivated investments a military makes in an individual human being. When that pilot dies during a routine training flight because of a decades-old airframe held together with reverse-engineered parts, rather than in actual combat, that's not just a tragedy for the family involved, it's also a loss the public record never got to fully explain before the war made the question moot. It's a pure, uncompensated loss for the Air Force itself. Years of training and specialized skill gone, with nothing gained in return, no enemy aircraft destroyed, no mission accomplished, just an accident report and a funeral. And Iran's own documented crash history suggests this specific kind of loss, pilots and sometimes even civilians on the ground killed by mechanical failure rather than combat, has been happening with enough regularity over the past several years that it represents an ongoing drain on exactly the kind of experienced aviators a country would need most if it ever actually went to war. Which, 8 days later, it did. And that drain matters more than it might first appear, because pilots, unlike airframes, can't be quickly replaced or reverse engineered. Iran can rebuild a damaged Phantom's airframe over 6,000 man-hours if it has to. It cannot rebuild a pilot with years of accumulated flight hours and combat training in anywhere close to that time frame. Every fatal training accident tied to aging, poorly maintained equipment doesn't just cost Iran an aircraft it struggles to replace. It costs Iran one of a genuinely small pool of experienced aviators trained to fly that aircraft in the first place, at the exact moment when every single one of those pilots was about to become far more valuable than usual. So here's the actual question this single crash leaves you with, and I think it's a genuinely difficult one to answer cleanly. If an Air Force, this degraded, this starved of legitimate spare parts, this prone to fatal training losses on its own soil, can still manage to catch a modern military off guard purely through underestimation, what does that tell you about how much weight should actually be put on equipment age when you're trying to predict how a conflict like this plays out? The easy assumption, the one apparently held by enough American planners to matter, was that decades-old jets equal a minimal threat. The Hamadan crash and everything that followed it suggests that assumption was, at minimum, incomplete, and in at least one documented case over Kuwait, actively dangerous to hold. And I think that's ultimately the real, uncomfortable lesson buried inside a single obituary out of a district most people outside Iran had never heard of before this war. It's tempting to read a story about ancient jets and reverse-engineered parts as a simple story of decline, a military running on fumes, propped up by decades of improvisation. And, in a lot of ways, that's exactly what it is. But decline and danger aren't opposites. A force that's falling apart can still land a punch precisely because everyone watching it assumes it can't. That's not a comforting conclusion, and it's not a tidy one either. It's just the evidence, pulled from Iranian state media, aviation trade press, national security analysts, and battlefield reporting alike, actually supports once you line every piece of it up in order. There's also an important distinction worth drawing here, because Iran doesn't actually have just one air force, and mixing the two up muddies exactly what this crash does and doesn't tell you. The aircraft at Hamadan, the F-4 Phantoms of the 31st Tactical Fighter Squadron, belong to the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force, the country's conventional military aviation branch. That's a separate organization from the IRGC Aerospace Force, the Revolutionary Guard's own parallel air arm, which operates a different mix of assets, heavily weighted toward ballistic missiles and drones rather than crewed fighter jets, though it does maintain some fixed-wing aircraft of its own, including some of those same aging Sukhoi types that got hit at Shiraz in the opening days of the war. This dual-track structure, a conventional Air Force flying antique American jets alongside a parallel Revolutionary Guard aerospace arm built more around missiles and drones, is itself a product of the same post-revolution isolation that's been the backbone of this entire story. Iran built an entirely separate, redundant military structure specifically because it never fully trusted its own conventional forces, the ones still flying equipment tied to the pre-revolutionary American-aligned era, to remain loyal to the new regime. So even the crash at Hamadan sits inside a bigger, stranger picture. An Air Force flying obsolete jets it can't fully replace, nested inside a broader military structure that was partly designed around the assumption that this specific branch might not always be fully trusted. What do you think this actually says about how militaries should be evaluating threats going forward? Age of equipment against real demonstrated capability. Do you think this changes how seriously aging air forces elsewhere in the world get taken from here on out? From analysts, from planners, and from audiences watching conflicts like this one unfold in real time? Every source in this breakdown, TRT World and Reuters, Al Arabiya citing Fars News, the Jerusalem Post citing Mer News and IRIB, key. Arrow's detailed reporting on both the Hamadan base and Iran's Phantom Maintenance Program, RFE-RL, and Sputnik's earlier coverage of Iran's broader crash history, National Security Journal, and the National Interest on the F-4's sanctions-driven maintenance struggles, Bolt Flight's full inventory breakdown, and the Eurasian Times reporting on how Iran's F-5s were actually used against Kuwait is publicly available right now for you to go check yourself. And I genuinely encourage you to do exactly that before locking in your own final read on any of it. Drop your read in the comments, because a single training accident in a province most people had never heard of turned out to be a far bigger window into this entire war than anyone realized when the story first broke. If this kind of source-by-source breakdown is useful to you, there will be more of it, pulling apart a single headline until you can see everything actually holding it up. Thanks so much for watching this entire breakdown all the way through, and I will see you all in the very next one.